Hello, class. Our first lecture is going to be on the origins of psychological science. The first person I'd like to talk about is William Wundt. He is considered the father of psychology. Now, keep in mind, William is not your typical researcher or your typical psychologist. The father of psychology originally struggled with academics. He eventually dropped out of high school at one point, but his scholastic aptitude and his accomplishments did eventually evolve, and he came back around to education. He actually ended up as the top graduate in his medical class. So he dropped out of high school and was able to finish medical school at the top of his medical class. He did also go on to establish the Institute for Experimental Psychology in 1879, and that was one of the beginning or first of these type of sort of laboratories or institutes. He relied on the scientific observation. He sought to train introspectionists to be systematic and scientific as they looked inward to report reactions to various stimuli. He studied vision, hearing, taste, touch, memory, time perception, as well as many other topics. He defined the task of psychology as the systematic study of the structure of the conscious mind. He believed that the conscious mental process could be understood by breaking them down into basic elements. He kind of, you know, phrased them as atoms of the mind. So he coined that phrase, atoms of the mind. The next person I'd like to speak about is William James. He's known as the father of American psychology. William James was a philosopher, a psychologist, and a leading thinker of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After he completed medical school, James focused on the human psyche, writing a masterpiece on the subject. It was entitled The Principles of Psychology. It's a big reason why a lot of intro to psychology classes are called Principles of Psychology or Intro to Psychology. William James had a very culturally rich and diverse childhood as he was educated at numerous private schools, but his fascination for areas such as religion and science were actually encouraged within his childhood home, along his very famous sibling, Henry James. Um, You'll learn more about William James's influence on Charles Darwin. And basically, in essence, James' work focused on how one's mind functions in their everyday life while adapting to the environment that's around them, which is what is known as functionalism. Now, functionalism considers behaviors in terms of active adaptations. Consciousness is ever changing. So the streams or images and sensations that are included in Darwin's principle of natural selection brought the study of, William James also brought the study of animals into psychology and actually promoted educational work on it. William James felt that the science of psychology would be better served by attempting to understand the fluid, functional, continually changing personal nature of consciousness and sort of that conscious experience. William James really, his emphasis was on the functional, practical nature of our mind. He wanted to understand the mental processes that helped humans and animals adapt to the environment around them. John Watson. Now, in essence, Watson argued that psychology as a science should, excuse me, should center upon observable behaviors, what one can see and measure, So much of his work, his beliefs were based on Pavlik's work. Watson argued that one could use conditioning to shape behaviors. A lot of American psychologists really publicized behavioralism at this point. And this was sort of an approach to psychology that, in John Watson's view, was really restricted by the objective, the experimental psychology or experimental study. And behavioralism emphasized the study of observable actions over the study of the mind itself. It observed relationships between a stimuli and an animal's response. It really takes Pavlov's dog, sort of, we'll get to that in a second, but that concept of conditioning could explain most behaviors that people and animals have. He believed that conditioning could change people's actions. And by 1913, John Watson initiated a sudden and dramatic approach to psychology, which replaced both structuralism and functionalism. Watson believed it was impossible to study the mind objectively, and really focused and opposed, introspection and using that in psychology. His stimulus response, or S.R approach, was really a radical change from what focused on this internal mental process. The goal of his behavioralism is to identify the process by which stimuli and responses become connected or associated. Essentially, it's how we learn. How do we learn? That was the focus, and he focused on that behavior. Behavioralism is characterized by its, you know, focus on empirical, objective science of behavior that has no need for theories of the mind or any sort of personal freedoms. The most famous individual associated with psychology, which anyone who's never even taken a psychology class before definitely has heard of, Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud is known for psychoanalytics. He's known for many, many things, but that's sort of the main focus that we know about him. Uh, Freud argued that we often push certain thoughts, such as threatening desires, into our subconscious or unconscious mind. And he was also a neurologist who believed that the act of repressing these urges eventually manifest into sort of a nervous disorder. And he saw that with a lot of his patients. You'll learn many of his famous supporters in this course, like Alfred, Carl Jung. His daughter Anna Freud was also a big follower and would follow in his footsteps and did a lot of research on ego. And Freud was born on May 6th in 1856 in the Czech Republic. It wasn't known as the Czech Republic when he was born, but that's sort of what we call it now. His father was a merchant. Freud developed the theory that humans have an unconscious mind in which sexual and aggressive impulses are perpetrated conflict from, suppressing it. And it's sort of a defense within us. Mental life is sort of like an iceberg. Picture an iceberg. There's only a small part of it that is actually exposed at any given time. He's also known for dynamic unconsciousness. And this is an area of the mind outside of personal awareness. This can be, a behavior deeply influenced by our unconscious thoughts, impulses, desires, especially when it comes to sex and aggression. We mentioned earlier how Sigmund Freud is known best in developed psychoanalytics. He believed that our unconscious mind in childhood experiences affects our behaviors as adults. Sexual urges were powerful energizers for human behavior. And he talked a lot about the cure is, you know, sort of getting more into the mind, talking about them, working them out, and moving forward with them. He's also well known, and this is not the average person doesn't really know him for this, but he is really big in the dream world, dream analysis, breaking down dreams, what they mean. You can't research dreams without talking about Sigmund Freud. So he dipped into a lot of different areas of psychology and is a true founding member of the psychology that we know today. The next person I'd like to talk about is Maslow. So Maslow, I'm sure you've heard Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's the same person. He believed in free will, so the ability to make conscious choices, humanistic psychology, where people are inherently good and have potential. He also believed that the top of his pyramid, the number one thing that anybody can reach, is self actualization. And this is where you have fully developed your personal potential. You're at the top of your game when you reach self actualization. Again, he is the creator of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow really de-emphasized the influence of both environmental events as well as unconscious processes in determining a human's behavior. The emphasis again was on free will and self-actualization. The next person we'll talk about is Max Wadimer. And he was first to advance the Jeslet point of view or viewpoint. In this type of psychology studies experiences of thinking, learning, personality, perception as far as whole units and not by parts like structuralism. According to this type of psychology, perceptions have a powerful tendency to form a meaningful pattern. B.F. Skinner. No one his belief was that no one perception or no one view can fully explain all of our behaviors and all of our processes. He believed that in fact there are 7 basic perspectives in psychology that relate to several areas. This includes the thought process, a cultural factor, a biology aspect, so a biological aspect, and one's goals, future or past or accomplished goals. For instance, you will learn in your reading that the psychodynamic perspective is embraced by many therapists today. The focus is on unconscious mind and how to influence our conscious behaviors. The behavioral perspective is still quite influential to this day. B.F. Skinner actually extended the work of John B. Watson, and he is credited with coining the theory of operant conditioning, in which he perpetrated that one's voluntary behaviors could be learned or reinforced when associated with a pleasurable circumstance. B.F. Skinner is also known for radical behavioralism. He believed that actions are controlled by rewards and by punishments. He rejected introspection and the concept of mind as an inappropriate subject matter for psychological science or a scientific psychology. He felt that behavior is best explained without a mental event. So the thinking process doesn't play into our behavior. And there are many examples of that. So, you drink alcohol and you kiss somebody you shouldn't have kissed. Was your thought process there in that behavior? So that's sort of what he believed. He believed there wasn't a thought process for a behavior, but sort of a punishment or a reward. The reward was, kissing that person you shouldn't have kissed. That's why you did it for that reward. So kind of an interesting view on that process. The next is Edward Titchener. And he was one of Wundt's students who would later bring many of his research principles to America and further expand upon them by forging a new view. And he called this structuralism, or examining the structure of one's mind, so how your mind operates. And one of William James' most famous students and one of my most favorite people to talk about is Mary Calkins. She actually completed all research requirements for a PhD from Harvard University. Now, Harvard University, we know as today is one of the leading universities, one of the hardest universities to get into. It was even harder when she was around. The hardest university to get into, the hardest university to graduate from. And she completed all requirements, published her dissertation, you name it, it was done. However, she was denied this graduation and to actually obtain the PhD for one simple reason. She was not a man. Harvard University was not going to issue a PhD to a woman. There has been many talks over many years as to are they going to award her a PhD. Obviously, she's no longer with us, but there was talks in the early 2000s again about it. And still, if you look in the PhD library, her dissertation is not published, and she has not yet been known as a Harvard University PhD graduate. So hopefully one day soon we will finally see her with a comma PhD at the end of her name. Um, the last person I want to touch on in this lecture is Ivan Pavlov. This is an additional approach to psychology known as classical conditioning. And we do get into this further in the course in detail. But the most famous form of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. This was a Pavlov was a psychologist who really focused on a reflex being generated by an unrelated stimulus. So, for example, he took the unconditioned stimulus of food and the unconditioned response of like salivating, with the dog's mouth. The classical conditioning part of that was I want the same reaction, but I want it by something that's not related to it at all. Naturally, when a dog sees their food, they start to salivate. This comes naturally. It's not something they think about, it just happens. So he was going to condition that the bell. So he would ring the bell. So the dog sees the food, hears the bell, starts to salivate, and does it over and over and over until every time that bell rang, the dog would salivate, even though there was no food for the dog around. So that was the original experiment. Just as a fun thing for you to think about, if you guys are fans of The Office, he used this same exact experiment, Jim and Dwight, when he would turn that computer ding and then hand Dwight an Altoid and he would put it in his mouth. And then he did that over a couple days over and over again. And then finally he stopped giving the Altoid and hit that button, the ba-ding, and then Dwight puts his hand out and he's like, what do you need? Well, he was conditioned based on that noise to get his reward. And that's all that I have for this lesson. Thank you guys so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.